Dzień dobry, czy właściwie dobry wieczór. Witam Państwa serdecznie. Ja się nazywam Karolina Ziembińska i jestem dyrektorką Muzeum Warszawy. Bardzo się cieszę, że możemy, po pierwsze, że możemy współpracować z Niemieckim Instytutem Historycznym, dlatego że to nas otwiera na nowe tematy, nowych gości, nową publiczność, a ten cykl, który tutaj realizujemy we współpracy i bardzo cieszymy się, że możemy go gościć, cykl dotyczący miast w dużej mierze, takiej geopolityki związanej z miastami, jest dla nas fascynujący i naprawdę pokazuje nam takie inne sposoby myślenia i mówienia o mieście, na czym bardzo nam zależało. Więc bardzo dziękuję za tę współpracę i przekazuję już czym prędzej mikrofon pani Magdalenie Selużywolskiej, dyrektorce Niemieckiego Instytutu Historycznego, która myślę, że bardzo serdecznie przywita naszego głównego bohatera dzisiejszego wieczoru, mówiąc też kilka słów o nim.
Dobry wieczór, więc ja również chciałam Państwa bardzo serdecznie przywitać i ja również bardzo cieszę się z tej współpracy. My wykłady, tak zwane wykłady wtorkowe organizujemy już od wielu lat. Przyznam się szczerze, że nie wiem od jak wielu, ale jak nastałam w Instytucie 10 lat temu, to już były i miały długą tradycję. Ale po raz pierwszy organizujemy te wykłady poza Instytutem, dlatego, że chcieliśmy spróbować jakiegoś nowego formatu i dotrzeć do nowej publiczności i bardzo się cieszę, że to się udało i że Muzeum Warszawy przyjęło nas w gościnne progi muzeum. To wcale nie jest takie oczywiste, że się coś takiego udaje zrobić, więc bardzo dziękuję muzeum za tę współpracę i odwzajemniam radość z tej współpracy. Nie chcę zajmować za dużo czasu takimi powitalnymi rytuałami. To zawsze jest jeszcze taka chwila czasu dla osób, które docierają trochę później i nic nie tracą. Ale pozwolę sobie oddać pałeczkę, dlatego że naszego gościa przywita dr Jan Musekamp, który jest zastępcą dyrektorki w Niemieckim Instytucie Historycznym w Warszawie. Jest historykiem, zajmował się też historią miast, konkretnie historią Szczecina w swojej pierwszej książce, a w swojej drugiej książce historią mobilności, kolei w Europie Środkowo-Wschodniej w XIX wieku, więc w tematach przestrzennych jest bardzo dobrze obeznany, a jest bardzo dobrze obeznany, zdradzę to, ponieważ jest uczniem profesora Schlögela i myślę, że dla obu panów to będzie bardzo miłe, jak Jan teraz przedstawi naszego dzisiejszego wykładowcę.
Dobry wieczór Państwu. Witam bardzo serdecznie tutaj w Muzeum Historii Miasta. Nazywam się Jan Musekamp i od pół roku jestem wicedyrektorem Niemieckiego Instytutu Historycznego w Warszawie i też się bardzo cieszę, że możemy ten cykl spotkań tutaj razem z Muzeum Miasta przeprowadzić i też przez to mamy trochę inną publiczność, większą i bardzo się z tego powodu cieszymy. Dzisiejsze spotkanie będzie po angielsku. Proszę więc zaopatrzyć się w sprzęt do słuchania tłumaczenia. Jeżeli ktoś jeszcze nie ma, słuchawki są dostępne tutaj. I ja już dalej będę mówić po angielsku. It's my great pleasure to introduce today our guest, Karl Schlögel. He is Professor Emeritus from European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder, which was also my alma mater. Since my early college years, I have been teaching, learning from Karl Schlögel, and we spent quite some time also with discussions on different topics. I also want to thank you, Karl, for being a great mentor and for also supervising my PhD and for being a close collaborator in all my endeavors in the past 20 years. Karl Schlögel grew up in the Swabian region of Bavaria. He studied philosophy, sociology, East European history and Slavic studies at Free University Berlin. In the early 1980s, he researched at the Lomonosov University in Moscow. After his return to Berlin, he worked as a journalist and author of several books on Moscow, St. Petersburg and East Central European cities. And in these very popular books, he changed the mental map of the then largely West German audience. This audience had completely forgotten about the entangled history of the German Eastern European region. In his academic career, Karl was a professor of Eastern European history in Constance in southern Germany, and later on, since 1995, at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder. After retiring from university, he remained very active as an author, and since 2013 he has turned his attention to Ukraine, writing numerous essays and books on the country and being a frequent guest on popular German talk shows. To list Karl Schlögel's numerous publications would fill the whole evening. So I want to mention just a few, and many of them are also available in English and Polish. So here's a short list. Reading Moscow, The Centers in the East, this is in Polish also, Środek leży na wschodzie, Europa w stadium przejściowym, St. Petersburg Laboratory of Modernity, In Space Read Time on the History of Civilization and Geopolitics, in Polish W przestrzeni czas czytamy, o historii cywilizacji i geopolityce, Moscow 1937, under the Polish title Terror i marzenie, Moskwa 1937. The Soviet Century, Archaeology of a Lost World, Ukraine, a Nation on the Borderland, Descent of Empires, Chanel No. 5 and Red Moscow, in its Polish translation, Zapach Imperiów, Chanel Numer 5 i Czerwona Moskwa, Grenzland Europa, Unterwegs auf einem neuen Kontinent, Odkrywanie nowoczesnej Europy, Próba archeologii, and just a couple months or years ago, American Metrics, which will hopefully also appear in Polish, a book where Karl Schlögel connects his knowledge on East Central Europe and Eastern Europe with his knowledge on the United States. It's a very interesting book, so if you have the chance, please get it. Karl has received numerous awards, including the Great Cross of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Leipzig Book Award for European Understanding, the Samuel Bogumił Linde Award, which was shared with Adam Krzemiński, the German Historians Award from the Berlin Institute for Advanced Study in History, and just last year, the award of the prestigious Gerda Henkel Foundation for his contributions to historical scholarship. Dear Karl, and also dear Sonia Margolina, it is our great honor to have you here today, and we are looking forward to your talk and also to the discussion afterwards. The floor is yours, Karl.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends. I have to say that I'm very impressed to have this invitation to come to Warsaw again. I haven't been here for years, and I'm impressed by the change, the transformation which is going on here in this city. I'm really impressed that you came to this conference, and I'm happy to see friends which I haven't seen for years now. Adam, we met 11 years ago in Kiev, and I hope that I can say something interesting for you. I mean, you know everything about East Central Europe, about the cities here, and I'm not sure that I can add something new for you. I've written a text, but probably it would be better to forget the written text and to speak freely. But I feel honored to be here at this very specific site in downtown Warsaw, the center of historic Warsaw in Starym Miasto. And I have to say, I have forgotten, I apologize that I do this in English. I do not know why we decided to give the talk in English. I think because, as far as I know, everybody now in Poland is speaking English. And everybody is fluent. Yes, this is a very important experience I had in the last years. It's different to other places in Europe that almost everybody here is speaking the lingua franca of the global age. So this was, I think, the reason why we decided to make it in English. Yes, I'm moved that we came to the museum, to Sirena, representing the rebirth of a city from the ashes after the horrible and consciously planned destruction during the German occupation of the city. If I'm right, Sirena is part of the complex of Warsaw museums, an outstanding place for the visualization of the history of the city, exhibitions, documentaries, newsreels, movies, and other materials which give us an idea of the exciting history of the Polish capital. It is a privileged place for this kind of presentation, and I thank the organizers of this series of talks that they have decided to organize the venue here. A thank you to Jan Musekamp, the director of the German Historical Institute, and his team for bringing me to Warsaw. Thank you to the director of this museum. For me, it is the opportunity to stroll the city in the next days to get an idea of the massive transformation and changes, to read time in the texture of the city of Warsaw. I never tried to do this in Warsaw since I had the feeling that Warsaw is one of the most complicated challenges in analyzing the social fabric of big cities, the fate of a capital in a century of extremes, as Eric Hobsbawm expressed it. I've seen a lot of cities in East Central Europe with the well-trained eyes of a professional observer and historian, but I always felt that my capacity to tell the story of Warsaw was all too much limited to cope with the radical breaks, disruptions, destructions, and reinventions. It would be, I guess, a good idea to read time, the time of the 20th century in space, to start with in Warsaw or places like Warsaw, suffering from the clashes and disasters unleashed on the territory and the lands of East and Central Europe. In the next 45 minutes or so, I will touch the following issues, hopefully interesting for you. The privilege of a historian of being an eyewitness, the impact of urban studies in a moment of herbicide, the autobiographical context of my urban studies, the central figure of exploring cities, the flaneur, the flânerie, or being an archaeologist, tracing and excavating the layers of time, the special case of Central Europe, and finally, what means urban studies in our time. The privilege of being an eyewitness. Historiography does not take place in a vacuum. Historians live in their time. Historiography depends in many ways from the questions which are put forth by the events and experiences of the epoch we live through. The end of an epoch, a historical term, finds always its expression in the external, not only visual forms of social and cultural life of a given political system and order. In a moment of acceleration of events, be this 1914, 1939, 1945, 1989 or 2022, we learn that everything appears in a new light, are new questions raised and new perspectives opened. There is a change, atmospherically, in the rhetoric, in gestures, in the attitudes of people on the top and below. This is the moment of bringing to the surface what has been prepared and matured in the years before. It is the sudden manifestation of what has emerged beyond the public sphere and accumulated on the margins, in the underground or in counterculture. We have the impression that the generation which around 1989 had the privilege to enter the period of the collapse of post-World War Europe had the privilege to eyewitness the great transformation, to get involved or to be part of radical, eye-opening processes reshaping everything. That means in the given context, the texture of urban environment and urban life was rewritten. The urban landscape or cityscape changed. New inscriptions, new forms, a new iconography, new brands covered up were redesigned. Old layers of the cityscape we were accustomed to were deleted, new ones emerged, new posters, instead of propaganda, the world of Marlboro and Coca-Cola. The new time was a time of rediscovery, of reopening spaces which had been closed or have been hidden for generations. Streets and neighborhoods which were condemned to decay had a chance to be saved and to be restored. A wave of restoration and rebuilding transformed the outlook of almost every city, some earlier, some later on. In many ways, I call that the miracle of resurrection, or even reinventing the city, inspired and moved by the revitalization of the civic society, small and medium businesses, global brands, enterprises, booming tourism, construction and upgrading of facilities of public transport, renovation of infrastructures. Call it great modernization. It is quite clear that here took place great change, which inspired and motivated a new interest in dealing with urban history, with self-understanding, with historical memory, reconstruction of the urban narrative, including urban mythologies and even inventing of histories which never existed before. What I wanted to say is that there is a historical phase for the new interest in dealing with urban history, that is the sura, the historical events, the re-evaluation and reinterpretation, stimulating new approaches, inspiring new directions of research and looking for new sources, not only archival sources. But there is, as everybody observes and knows, a flip side of this process too. To find new ways means simultaneously to leave old ways of thinking and doing. Things which were crucial for the older generation lost their relevance and fell to oblivion, indifference, even disdain or hate. Nietzsche's Umwertung der Werte, revaluation of values. Attempts to get rid of the communist past. This took many different forms: demolition of memorials, renaming of streets and squares, destruction of libraries, retribution of real estates due to privatization, breakdown of enterprises, factories, professions which had become unprofitable. Layers of urban life which had been the natural, familiar, accustomed environment for generations dissolved, disappeared, and remained as relics of the past, subject now for archaeologists of a vanished world. The label for this more or less spontaneous process can be called de-Sovietization, decommunicatia, decolonization, remapping and redesigning the symbolic cityscape, the musealization of the cityscape which has emerged during the Cold War and inside the Soviet rule over Eastern Central Europe. This is what we experienced in the last 30 years or so. But now the European scene has changed again, unexpectedly and fundamentally. What we, at last my generation, know only from documentaries, exhibitions, family albums, takes place in reality under our eyes. The physical destruction of cities, herbicide, not in a metaphorical but in real, physical, deadly terms. Cities under daily fire, bombing, targeting residential areas, supermarkets, railway stations, ports, hospitals, energy infrastructure, kindergartens, libraries, museums, bridges, dams, in short, the basis of urban civilization. You know what I'm talking about. The cities of Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, Lviv, Slavyansk, the devastation and annihilation of industrial cities like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Mariupol. We are the eyewitnesses of what we have seen earlier only in historical documentaries. When I was in Donetsk in spring 2014, looking at the takeover of the regional administration building by Russian special forces dressed as Don Cossacks, I could not imagine that someday 1 million city would become a battlefield. I could not imagine visiting Mariupol and its metallurgical factories, that someday they would cease to exist and transformed into sites under siege. It was on the square in front of Mikhailovsky Monastery in Kiev where I have seen an open-air exhibition with posters showing photographs of the ruins of Warsaw after 1944 and Mariupol 2022. I'm saying this in order to stress that our perception of the history of the urban civilization is formed not only by reading books, but inspired by our immediate impression of ongoing processes, provoked and even trained by surrounding events. Present time as a training for perceiving urban history, leaving aside any nostalgic illusions or mythologies of genius loci. Some remarks about my motivation and the autobiographical background. Before going into a more systematic outline of what I understand in reading time and space, I want to tell you why this issue has become relevant and why it's now already an entire scholarly life dealing with the question why space is relevant, the Habermasian question of knowledge and interest. There are three motivations I can find in retrospective. First, coming from a village in Bavaria, I found cities always fascinating, more than the countryside and world of the village, which is in fact fascinating too and worth of reading time and space. Even more convincing than the urban landscape sometimes. Second, there was an experience, maybe an event, an epiphany, decisive and igniting a passion for the urban. An early trip across the Iron Curtain in the 1960s to Prague, the discovery of the world beyond, the experience of otherness. First of all, the experience of an European metropolis, at least in its appearance, seemingly undamaged, not touched by the disasters which had changed the German cities during Second World War. Carpet bombing, I mentioned, and the brutalist post-war city planning in architecture, radically changing the historic scheme of the pre-war cities, and in total opposition to what Poland decided to do in reconstructing these heavily destroyed cities, which we can see today. It's unbelievable and should be a lesson for how Germany dealt with the post-war cityscape and architecture. Pre-war Prague, in my perception, was the Central European metropolis representing the continuity, the cultural capital, and the legacy and the heritage, the vitality, you may say, the eternity of the urban. Third, I learned in my life by viewing and looking around for orientation in environment that space, not only time, matters. Geography, topography, in my perception, were not less important than chronology, not less important than the chronological narrative and timeline. But in post-war Germany, the vocabulary used for the perception and analysis of space was contaminated, corrupted by the Nazi discourse, the Nazi abuse of space. As you know, Lebensraum, Ostraum, Blut und Boden, blood and soil, Heimat, homeland, etc. So the discourse on space was discredited in general, quite different from the discourses going on in France since the school of the Annales, Fernand Braudel, Lucien Febvre, Georges Lefebvre. So I felt always challenged to bring back against the mainstream historiography the spatial categories to historic narration, which coincided with tendencies in other countries, in the US, for instance, with critical postmodern geography by Edward Socha, for instance. In the last years, obviously, there's a kind of ideologization of space in the fascination and in the fashionable turn to geopolitics going on. There is a new discourse on space in the context of new geopolitics, especially in the US and in Russia, very often in reference to Carl Schmitt's Großraum, great space, large space, in the discourse of the neo-Eurasianist ideologists like Alexander Dugin. I feel close to a quite different tradition of spatial thinking. There is a long tradition of spatial thinking in the cultural studies, travelogues, memoirs, chronicles, in fiction as well as in non-fiction. There is a genealogy of thinking and writing in spatial categories, of course, since Herodot, from Alexander von Humboldt to Walter Benjamin. But in general, thinking space was the privilege of rather conservative, sometimes even reactionary thinkers and scholars. In my case, the decisive impulse was not reading this or that book, the discovery of an excellent or unique text, but the involvement and confrontation with the real city, which I learned starting with reading Moscow in the early 1980s. The city as a text, more and more I systematized this in the following years, exploring the cities in East Central Europe, the region, which was the main subject of writers and intellectuals like Milan Kundera, Czesław Miłosz, Danilo Kish, Claudio Magris, and others, but also figures like the great American historian Louis Mumford. Cities like Krakow, Łódź, Szczecin, Riga, Vilnius, Lviv, Chernovtsi, Odessa, Trieste, Brno, Vienna, Budapest, and others. These are also texts and essays in my books. These cities became my field of exploration, of systematic excursions, the training field for description and analysis. Some of these books are translated, as Jan told, into Polish. The central figure of this way of perceiving and appropriating the urban world was discovered as a key figure by Franz Hessel, Walter Benjamin's friend and colleague, and of course Walter Benjamin himself, the flaneur and his way of exploration and reflection, the flânerie. The flaneur is a person of complex perception of a complex world. He uses his or her senses, is interested first of all in the perception of phenomenons, not so much in building systems and constructing models. He or she is fascinated by the analysis of surfaces, going into details. He or she is not obliged to walk along a previously defined parcours. The flaneur moves around, follows his or her instinct and curiosity. The flaneur is a well-trained navigator, well prepared with a mass of information in his or her head. All kinds of material and documents which are available to grasp the complexity of the urban universe are at hand: maps, memoirs, eyewitness reports, oral history narrations, statistics, city directories, photographs, diaries, etc. The entire pool of information accumulated over years and decades. Quite often, navigating across the mainstream is much more interesting and inspiring than going along the main street, main stream. There's a chance to discover new things and to look from diverse and different perspectives. Navigating and strolling the city is not just a walk or promenade, but a way of discovery, attentive working with the eyes, deciphering the mosaic of details, collecting materials. To do that, you have to learn the craft and art of detailed description, which is quite different from taking a picture on your smartphone. Navigating the urban space is based not only on the complexity of perception, but also on a broad and large repertoire of sources. As historians, we have learned to use archival materials, paper documents, handwritten or printed materials. We are focused on texts, but as spatially experienced professionals, we look into private homes, walk through streets, and rest in front of public monuments. We are interested in design and architecture, the everyday life of citizens who do not depend exclusively on text and paperwork. The repertoire is endless, and the main problem and decision is how to define the perspective and how to select among the overwhelming mass of impressions and materials. Since it is clear that we do not talk only about the physical or geographical space, but about cultural landscapes too, we understand the enormous complexity of the subject and the difficulty of coming to terms with the urban universe. In this situation, we look around in order to find ways for telling the story, for the narration, and it seems to me that other disciplines than that of historiography are much better prepared for coping with the urban fabric. I have in mind literature, fiction and non-fiction, which have the language and find ways of description and composition of the urban universe. I have in mind the great novelists like Victor Hugo, James Joyce, Ulysses, Alfred Döblin, Alexanderplatz, John dos Passos, Manhattan Transfer, Andrei Bielik, Petersburg, Władysław Reymont, Ziemia Obiecana, or Italo Calvino, The Invisible Cities. We find ways of representing the complexity of the urban fabric in cinema because the camera is able to bring together the senses, the visual, the audible, and has the capacity to tell the story of simultaneous processes in one and the same spot through the technique of montage. It allows a narrative of simultaneity, which is very important. The spatial dimension entered the field of historiography from the side, I would like to say, via other and neighboring disciplines, the history of architecture and art, city planning, the biographical genre, urban, local and area studies, and the like. But as historians, we are subjected to these documents, to the veto of sources, as Reinhard Koselleck has told. We are not allowed, as fiction writers can do, to write about imagined and virtual events or to invent persons and activities. We are forced to work with reality. One of the books of the distinguished German philosopher Hans Blumenberg has the title The Readability of the World. And he had in mind books, texts through which we get to know the world. Using the title, I have in mind a different idea, that we are able to analyze and decipher the phenomena of the world itself, as I have tried to explain above, the surfaces, the visible structures, the environment, sites and spaces we move in. Talking about the complex universities of cities, we are not lost in chaos. We can find some orientation looking at the structures which have been developed over decades and generations. We are not only flaneurs, but in a certain way, we are also archaeologists. We navigate in vivid landscapes, but also in between ruins, the fragments left by former generations. We use city plans to discover the different layers, the sedimentation of life centuries ago. With the help of these plans, descriptions, directories, memoirs, we are able to reconstruct vanished monuments, sites of historical events, and of everyday practices. There is perhaps no general formula how to do this, but some observations and experiences help us to find our way. Referring to my experience of exploration, I followed certain steps to define the representative structures. Arrival situation, the entrance into the city, thinking about natural location, position in the landscape, position in the network of communication, situated along a river or in the mountains, in the plain, the question of climate and more general questions. Or analyzing the skeleton, the structure of the city, the plan of streets, squares, neighborhoods, industrial areas, parks, etc. Or the structures of rule and power, the castle, the fortress, the city wall, the town hall, the market, and the places of trade and business. Or, very important, the ritual sites of religion, churches, mosques, synagogues, monasteries, representing diverse confessions and beliefs. Or the structures of education and culture, schools, universities, theaters, opera houses, museums, entertainment institutions. Or the centers of detention, very, very important, courts, penitentiaries, prisons, military camps, and of course the site of camps in general. The ordinary houses of the ordinary citizen beyond the skyline of finance and money, or to come to an end, the cemeteries, the cities of the dead, the necropolis. They are more invisible inhabitants of the past than in the present time and existing city. For all these structures, buildings, places, etc., we do have tools of analysis and interpretation. Every epoch has its own specific style and outlook. This is the job of historians of culture, style, architecture. The analysis of forms, be that facades or interiors, towers or gates, monuments or parks, is the way of reconstruction of the stage where the person of historic events acted. I'm not in favor of pushing, and I would like to stress this, pushing a new turn after the linguistic or after the iconic turn, now the special turn. But I am convinced there is no history and no historiography without taking into account the place where history takes place. Every epoch has its own style, incorporation of the spirit of the time. Every landscape, state or nation is represented in a certain typology, certain configuration, ensemble or solitary and unique remnant. It is important to understand that beneath or beyond the really existing city, there are also invisible cities, imagined cities, unbuilt cities. And I'm not talking about the imagination of poets, or about lyric poems, but of real plans of rebuilding, enlarging the existing cities. Almost every epoch has new plans for the new and much more comfortable city, has projects, the result of architectural competitions, of failed ideas of prestigious world fairs, unbuilt skyscrapers and other superstructures of pride and prestige. But now we have to try to apply this to the region which is under concern here. In the given context of my talk, I do not elaborate on cities, let's say, in South America, the Mayan cities in Yucatan, or the ancient Egypt empires, but I'm talking about East Central Europe. I have in mind the following ones. The characteristic features for cities and the cityscapes in East Central Europe. This is the countries, states, societies of Central Europe were for centuries subject and part of large multi-ethnic empires, which had a strong political, cultural impact. Second, the nation-states emerged from the collapse of the empires, were mixed societies in linguistic, religious, cultural, ethnic terms, states with large minorities. The heritage of the multi-ethnic empires were the existence of large minorities. Third, the area of the former empires were areas of moving borders, and borders were not identical with ethnically homogeneous states. East Central Europe as an area of great areas of great heterogeneity, religious, linguistic, social, and conflicts, finally in a process of unmixing nations. Fourth, the transnational minority par excellence were the Jews who settled in East Central Europe since the anti-Jewish wave in Western Europe in the 14th century. The former Pale of Settlement was the center of European Jewry. It became the main area of the annihilation during the Shoah. Sixth, in the 20th century, East Central Europe was defined for more than one generation as the sphere of domination and interaction of totalitarian powers, Nazi Germany and Communist Soviet Union. During First and Second World War, Central Europe was the main battlefield with huge losses of civilian population, destruction, exhaustion. East Central Europe was the subject of two dictatorships. The consequences of these features, the imperial legacy, the mixed nations and the unmixing of nations, the moving borders, the destruction of the transnational connections, the unprecedented violence unleashed during World War II against the civilian population, the extinction of the center of the European Jewry, all these processes are reflected in the face and the spirit of the cities of East Central Europe. These features you can find during our explorations in any city of the region, big and small ones. I can suggest this only in an exemplary way. And my case is Vilnius, Vilno, Vilna, Vilne. When I was first time in Vilnius in the 1980s, there was no proper city map reproducing the real city, but there was a Soviet plan. But I was able to navigate the city using the maps I have found in the Berlin State Library. The set of maps showed me the city in the following periods: pre-war, pre-World War I, the Russian Empire city; German occupation during World War I; Polish Vilno after occupation; the Soviet occupation after 1939; the German occupation between 1941 and 43; the Soviet reoccupation; and Vilnius after getting the independence 1991. There was a special map, and there was a special map designing Jerusalem of the East, the ghetto. Every map was designed from a different point of view. Strolling the city, one can identify all the layers of the history of Lithuanian people and state. The castle of Grand Duchy, the St. Kazimierz Cathedral of the Polish-Lithuanian Kingdom, the churches and monasteries of all the dominations, Reformation and Counter-Reformation, Baroque and Gothic, the palace of the Russian governor, the prison which served up to the late 1990s to many regimes, the cemeteries, among them the Rossa Cemetery, and the offices used by NKVD, Gestapo, KGB on Gediminas Street. There were street names reminding the Jewish quarter, the empty space with kindergarten, the site of the great synagogue of the Gaon, demolished by Germans and finally pulled down after the liberation and occupation of the Soviet army. In the outskirts in Panarai, there you could find the site of mass starvation of Soviet prisoners of war and mass execution of the Vilna Jews. Finally, you can walk on the squares and streets where the last chapter of Lithuanian history was executed, the square where the Lithuanians defended their parliament against Gorbachev's tanks in January 1991. Since Lithuania's independence, you can find, of course, tourist information, a lot of new history books and monographs, city guides, and the memoirs of authors like Thomas Venclova or Czesław Miłosz and others. We could go through other examples, case studies of the urban world in Central Europe, not as a nostalgic tourist of Belle Epoque or on the traces of dark tourism. But we can get an idea, an approximate image of the complexity of the place and the possibilities of excavating history. I'm coming to an end now. Urban studies for our time. For most people coming from the West who do not have a personal or familiar relationship to the region, visiting the nations beyond the former demarcation line is, I guess, a great adventure and discovery. It is the way of enlarging the personal horizon of experience. It contributes to reformulate the idea of Europe and European history. This is very, very important. When the Russian war against Ukraine started, most people in the West, including people from academia, did not have an idea of cities like Odessa, Kharkiv, Lviv. Due to the war, these important European cities and capitals were put on the mental map of European citizens, at least in the West. On everybody's mental map exist cities like Venice, Marseille, Strasbourg, Cologne, but who did have an idea of the cities I mentioned? They have disappeared for a long time, due to World War II, due to the Cold War, and the limited and restricted information and possibilities to travel to these places. Now, everyday news give us lessons in European geography and history. The urban landscape of East Central Europe, with its rich cultural legacy and heritage, human capital, memory, is essential, indispensable part of Europe. This is of central importance when we talk about Europe, especially in a moment when Europe is forced to reinvent, to redefine itself in relation to other continents and to defend itself. Particularly in a situation of uncertainty, self-doubt, destabilization, it is necessary to make sure and make clear who we are. Particularly the cities, understood as the crystallization of our civilization, give us an idea to find an answer to this question. They show us the richness, the risks, and what is at stake. So it is not only an academic topic, something for urbanists and insiders, but for renewing and building up of the social and cultural self-consciousness, which is so important for the self-defense of Europe under attack. They are sites where the future of the continent will be decided. This is what I tried to tell you, and I thank you very much for your attention. And I would like, if I did not meet your interest and did not find answers to your questions, we have a chance now for question and answers. I thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much for this rich panorama, I think we call it. I was thinking about the flaneur, which is a figure going back to 19th century, and I was wondering, in 21st century cities, how does a flaneur have to adapt to the realities of 21st century? And that brought me to think that there has been, also post-World War II, there have been some alternative suggestions how to experience cities, such as among Situationists artists group with the concept of the Derive, and organizing things like a grand tour of Manhattan lavatories, so of kind of before off the beaten track was pretty much advertised everywhere. That's perhaps my question. What challenges does the flaneur face in the 21st century? And have you ever considered alternative models of how to explore a city?
Thank you for your question. That's a very good question, which I'm trying to dealing since long. Of course, the flaneur is the 19th century figure. I had this problem to use this figure for my own exploration. And I had written a piece years ago from Herodot to Los Angeles. And what is the way to understand and to explore an entirely new way of urban life is as described by Davis in City of Quartz and others. And I have a chapter in my America book about moving in Los Angeles, and there the flaneur is lost in Los Angeles, and you have to find the proper way for any situation. And the way to move and to learn Los Angeles, of course, the car in the automobile age. And I discovered, and it's, I would say, a fantastic book by Rainer Bernham, the British art historian. He passed away a couple of years ago. He came to Los Angeles and wrote a book on how to learn to move in Los Angeles. And this was the key for me to say farewell to the Benjamin Flaneur and to take the car and to find a way of develop a perspective on new ways of mobility and of society based on this kind of mobility. Probably you have to find for every specific situation a specific approach, and I mean there are beautiful examples. There's a German author, Wolfgang Büscher, who is professionally walking. He walked by foot from Berlin to Moscow, or from Chicago to Santa Fe through the heartland, or his last book is about walking through the Sahara as the way of understanding which spaces you are crossing. And this is not flaneur going. This is not flaneur, but a different way. And I think you have to, in general, you have to find the special type of moving to get access and to find into the world you are exploring. So I agree in general, yeah.
Thank you very much. And there's a question in the back, Andrew Tompkins.
Thank you very much for your talk and for the very inspiring body of work behind it as well that you've produced over many years. I think you said at some point in the autobiographical section of your talk something about coming from a village in Bavaria, you always found cities fascinating, and including cities or towns in a rural space. I'm not sure if I understood that correctly, but I wanted to ask you, are there ways in which you would seek to read space, read time and space differently within rural space? Are there different kinds of places you would look for to try and understand those spaces? Or are there ways in which you would want to integrate thinking about the natural environment into that?
The natural environment?
Yes.
The natural environment.
I don't know whether I understood the question. Coming from the village to the city, you are full of prejudices, expectations, experiences, and in a certain way, maybe I didn't get the core of your question. Sometimes I feel that coming from outside to the metropolitan region or to the urban fabric is a privilege because you are looking from outside and you perceive things which are not perceived by people who grow up in this milieu. And so it has some advantages to come from outside and to perceive things which are taken for granted, but which are in fact things you have to perceive and to. You can see coming from outside, you can see things which are people do not realize or perceive who are accustomed to live in this surrounding. But probably I did not get, or can you?
Maybe you can rephrase the part with the environment again.
Yes, I think I was wondering how you would turn your attention to a non-urban space. How you would perhaps use elements of the environment or environmental history to read time in space outside of an urban context. Or my colleagues adds, if one can even do that in the center alone.
Auf dem Land. Darum geht es, glaube ich, im ländlichen Raum.
Yes, I mean I'm following. I'm interested in looking on the ländliche Raum, on the countryside, because I think the transformation which took place after World War II on the countryside are enormous and reflecting the grand transformation of the post-war society. I've written about this too, and I'm looking also now what's going on there, and the changes on the countryside are as indicative as the changes in the cityscape, but probably maybe I don't have a naive relation to natural, to the nature, in this case, I think that Alexander von Humboldt describing his experiences on the Orinoco is the best example how to describe and to analyze nature and landscapes. But my view and my eye is trained on looking on urban landscape. I never wrote about other things. Maybe Central Park in New York.
I mean, we should add that you did also work on the Oder River and explored this very natural room
that's
space.
true.
Yeah,
Yes.
so that was an important contribution. I think that's what you had in mind.
There was no mental capacity to rebuild cities in a way that they would look as they did before the war started. So I don't see this break. I don't think we can support the thesis of a break in urban planning because the continuities in persons, in political bodies, and also in contents are enormous in Western Germany. This is just overwhelming. And I think this also relates to the idea that there was a tabuization of space in post-war German academic discourse. Well, maybe so in history or other humanities, but in the disciplines that dealt with space, such as geography, such as city planning, and others, there is this continuity, and they are not afraid of any. They are not taboos, and Fritz Todt is still was highly esteemed for like his planning, at least in these circles. So perhaps that needs some more differentiation.
Yes, there's continuity, but in general, continuity not only from city planning and architecture of the Nazi time. I mean, people like Eimer Mann and Niels Gutschow and other people. This is well studied now, but there's also a continuity of pre-Nazi Bauhaus traditions, and to jump into the automobile age. I mean, Scharun and his planning for Berlin with highways, etc., to create the city for the automobile age. There are continuities from the Nazi time and continuities from the pre-Nazi time, and but in general, I would say there was a break and an incompetence and non-capacity to recreate and to find ways of recreating and to create a continuity of these the great heritage of the destroyed cities. And I think it had to do with the moral disaster. It had to do with the elementary material situation, that it was a country destroyed. But the main difference, I would say, to Poland, as far as I understand, and I have seen the albums of reconstructing Warsaw under Bierut, and the pride to do it, they decided to reconstruct their country liberated from occupation, and there was an entirely different mood to recreate the traditional what has been destroyed by the occupation forces, and especially by the Nazi occupation and the destruction. So, yeah, I would insist on that, that it was one of the consequences of the moral and financial and material destruction of Germany. Yeah.
Yeah, and Magda, we need the mic. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this inspiring talk, which also is very important for me personally, because years ago I wrote my dissertation under the title Urban Memory, and it was highly inspired by your writings. But I have a question relating or related to your style also, because you mentioned, and I agree, that for historians it is quite difficult to see the city or the space as a source to bring it to a narrative. And that's a challenge. You mentioned also that literature or cinema are probably media that deal easier with space. And nevertheless, you for yourself found a very fruitful way of writing about space and cities. And I know some of your students, and I know that they manage too. So you must have some kind of a method, or I don't know, some kind of a how do you say in English, a Ratschlag, advice. Yeah, thank you, of how to bring a space, especially urban space, which is extremely dense, extremely visual, extremely material, extremely textile, of how to bring it into a readable academic text that is still an academic one and not literary imagination. And I know it's a huge question, but I would be very much interested in any of you on that.
Yeah, that's a question which is fascinating me very much. I think the question is unsolved, and it would be one of. I would like, before ending my life, I would like to solve this problem. What is the historiographical narrative which is able to tell the story not only in chronological terms, but in spatial terms? And I have to say, I have to talk to people who have worked on this, also to Reinhard Koselleck. I mean, he was one of the early historians who talked that the timeline and the spontaneous predominance of time in historiography, this is not, it's a spontaneous dominance of time. But he himself, he never solved the question how you can develop a narrative where time and space are in symmetric relation. And he discussed it in his great speech on the Historiker Tag in Trier in the early 80s, but he never himself contributed to solving this question. And I have to say, I tried to do it in the sense that my writing of history, let's say the modernity in Petersburg, the Great Terror in Stalin times, I tried to solve it concentrating concentrating the narrative of 1 year in 1937 on one place, that means Moscow. And I think I found a way to do it, and I was so happy that I could finish this book only because I met an author, Bulgakov, in his Martha and Margarita, when I discovered that the Margarita was flying over the city into freedom, and this perspective of the flying Margarita looking over the city and having a perspective on all these events which took place in 1 year. That was show trials, prisons, beautiful cinema premieres, big construction of the city. I could not finish this book without having found this way of telling the story. And I called it, I have written about this, what is a narrative of simultaneity? And I have not found a general formula how to do it. I did it in my case for Petersburg, telling the story of a decade, 1909 to 1920, based on one city. I did it for Russian Berlin, about the Russian-German connections based on the place, that means Berlin. And in a certain way, I did it in my book on the Soviet century and American matrix. This is not the story of the United States from the Declaration of Independence up to 9/11. It's not a chronological story. My way of telling the story is to go in a horizontal way, not in a chronological, but going, traveling, walking on the surface of what I learned in America. So I think, in general, a narrative of simultaneity has to be developed. And I find that in Musil, in Joyce, the more, or let's say, Eisenstein in his montage, in his the proper ways to find a language and a way of telling the story. And I have not to say what is the importance of narrative of simultaneity. If it's not clear, I have to say, usually you have specialists and experts for certain aspects. You have an expert for terrorism, for Stalin terrors. You have an expert for the history of cinema. You have an expert for social realism, etc. But the main question of 37, for instance, was that all these things happened at the same time, at the same place. You could see Hollywood in Moscow, the huge films of, you know them, and you had mass demonstrations on Red Square, demanding the execution of the spies, the wreckers, etc. Or in 1937, you had demonstrations on Pushkin Square, the anniversary of Pushkin's death, and the institutionalization of Pushkin as the canonical figure. You had posters, long live Pushkin and long live Yezhov, side by side. side by side. And if you if you want to understand what happened in 37, you have to find a way to tell the story of this simultaneity of torture and enthusiasm, and it's not it's not an apology of find a middle way, a way of how to combine and to, but it's a way to find a language for things which happened at the same time, and people could not understand why all this happened. That they constructed the biggest structure of the world, 420 meters, higher than Empire State Building, but at the same time that people in were tortured and exposed in these show trials, in this fantastic and unbelievable accusations, etc. The narrative of simultaneity, this is the epistemological problem, and it's not a question of literary, of a job of a writer. It's not, I mean, I have got a lot of compliments that I'm a good writer, that I can tell a story, but it's not a question of the literary capacity to write a story. It's an epistemological problem. How to bring together time and space in a symmetric relation, and to escape from the domination of just the chronological. And there's a wonderful quotation by Musil, and especially Musil is the great master of telling the narrative of simultaneity in his Mann ohne Eigenschaften. And this is, in my view, the challenge for historiography. I do not deny that you have to make a specialized analysis, etc., etc., but to find a way to integrate this is, in my view, unsolved, and it would be a great, everybody who could find a way of, or a general formula, or a way, it would be a great advantage, or,
So if anyone has solved this problem, I think it's you. And I can say from my experience as your student, so you always told us if there is a place or a historical problem, drive there, go there, travel there, and look around. And I think that was the best advice you could give. You need to see the place, you need to feel it, you need to experience it. And the other very good advice you gave, or also practice it, is the idea of excursiologia, the idea that we should go on the trip, we should not start with the archives, we should probably also not start with the books, but we should experience the place and go and have a look. I think that was something that many of your students has inspired and also has led to maybe not solving this mystery or this question, but at least going in the direction of what you had in mind. So we can take, I think, one more question.
I would like to have to ask a question. What is?
Can you please speak to Michael?
What is your recommendation? I've told you that I surrendered to the problem how to find a way to tell the history on access to the history of Warsaw, and I cannot imagine. What would you recommend going into a bookstore now, tomorrow? What should I read? I mean, there are libraries, hundreds of books, but if you have points an advice. For me, for instance, this book of Rainer Benham, The Four Ecologies of Los Angeles, that was a key. I just understood what he opened something and how to grasp and how to come to terms to find an access to this overwhelming, fantastic, fascinating and shocking history.
So maybe we can collect some answers. Favorite books of the audience on Warsaw?
But in Polish or in which language?
Can be in Polish. We'll check if we can find it also in other languages. Preferred is probably German or English. Can you please? Yeah. Thank you.
Jednak po polsku. Błażej Brzostek, Wstecz. Historia Warszawy opowiedziana od dziś wstecz do początków. Ta książka ma zresztą w tej sali tą zaletę, że jest wydana przez muzeum, które nas wszystkich tu gości. Dziękuję.
Beata Homontowska, Nieistniejące miasto, so a story, an essay on Muranów, which is the former ghetto district, Jewish district, and rebuilt in a socialist style. And I think it's, you would like it. It's simultaneous in a way.
I would highly recommend you a photo book about the district Praga in the 1980s, 1970s.
Yeah.
What is the title of the book?
I don't know yet. So I have one at home, but I don't know the exact title. It's something like photographies from Praga in the 1980s. You will find something.
I've been there today.
Oh.
Thank you so much. More suggestions for the library.
Warszawy, Dni Powszednie, Karoliny Bailey.
Long list.
Yeah, let's keep it to a short list, but there's one more recommendation.
Maybe on German, Heberer, Wiederaufbau der Warschauer Altstadt nach dem Zweiten Weltkrieg.
Aber warum statt der Papierwerk rauskam, ist gut. Und das ist auf Deutsch.
Okay, we have a list. Okay, we'll compile a list and send it to you.
Yeah.
And if we get hold of the books, we can also see if we can, or the essays we can send to you as well. Okay, thank you very much, Karl, for being here today. And thank you, audience, for being so patient and for asking very interesting questions. The next event is in May.
Mai 6th, Martina Löw.
On May 6th with Martina Löw. So again, we'll have translation here. So it will be English and Polish. And so let's thank Karl for being here and for giving the talk.
Thank you.